So as was mentioned, I'm the editor of the Stanford Social Innovation Review. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, I'll just give a quick snapshot of what we do. We started publishing in 2003. Our magazine is written by and for leaders of social change. One of the things that's unique about it is that we're written for leaders of social change regardless of the sector, whether it's business, nonprofits, government, foundations. We believe that collaboration amongst all those sectors is the key to solving the problems that we face in the world today. One of the most interesting trends that we've seen here in the last 5 to 10 years has been the impact that Silicon Valley has had on the social sector. And I'm not just referring to the technology. I mean, the technology is kind of obvious, things like social media and the web and organizations like Kiva and whatnot. But I'm talking also about the money, vast amounts of money that have been made in Silicon Valley is now being redistributed to philanthropic, through the philanthropic arena to nonprofits and other organizations. I'm also talking about the people, and I'm also talking about the way of doing business. Social entrepreneurship, venture philanthropy, impact investing, all of those buzzwords are terms that I think you can trace pretty clearly to Silicon Valley and its influence on the social sector. And this afternoon, we're very lucky to have with us two people who come from Silicon Valley but are now very engaged in the social sector. John Wood, to my immediate right, is the founder and co-chairman of Room to Read. Tim Kugel is the co-chairman of Room to Read. Both of them spent many years in Silicon Valley. John spent 8 years at Microsoft before leaving to found Room to Read. Tim was at Motorola for, I guess, 9 years, and then founding CEO and chairman of Yahoo. So what I wanted to do is to start out by giving each of them just an opportunity to describe basically how they made this migration from the for-profit Silicon Valley world to being engaged with Room to Read. And I'll start off with John. You had a very successful career at Microsoft, and yet you dropped it to take on, talk about passion and risk-taking. I think your story really exemplifies that. And I wonder if you could just take a few minutes to talk about what you were doing at Microsoft and what caused you to make such a big change in your life.
Yeah, so, oh boy, let's adjust that so I don't have dogs barking in the neighborhood and they hear. So I joined Microsoft in 1991 when it was about a 5,000 person company. I started as a product manager doing grunt work, box design, data sheet design. I basically reported to a person, reported to a person, reported to a person, reported to a guy like Tim. It was a very, very low level in the company. And then as the international markets grew, my responsibility grew, and I eventually ended up as director of marketing for the Asia Pacific region. And in 1998, I went off to Nepal on an 18-day trek. Have any of you trekked in the Himalayas? A few of you, probably about 10 of you. So, a fantastic place. There was a rumor that if you went high enough in the Himalayas, you could escape the sound of Steve Ballmer yelling at you to work harder. And so I decided to test that out, and I went off to Nepal on an 18-day trek in the Annapurna range. And on day 2 of my trek, I met a headmaster who invited me to come see his school. And this is in a rural village in Nepal. It's a 2-day walk from the nearest road. And like many schools in the developing world, it's simultaneously hopeful and pathetic. It's hopeful because 450 kids are showing up to school every day. And this is in a country that has 75% illiteracy rates. So kids are showing up, but it's pathetic the conditions they're being asked to learn in. Dirt floors, sheet metal roof that heats the room to 120 degrees, 80 kids in a room that should probably hold 30. And I was depressed by this tour. And the headmaster then said, well, let's go see the school's library. And I got excited. How many of you were library nerds as kids? Yeah, I mean, more than that. Come on, you're at a social innovation summit on a sunny day. And this room is probably full of a lot of library nerds. So I'm proud to say I was a library nerd as a kid. I thought this would be the hopeful part of the tour. I walked into the library, and it was a library in name only. It was completely devoid of books. And I asked the headmaster, why? Why do you not have any books in your library? You have 450 kids. And he said, well, in Nepal, we are too poor to afford books. We are too poor to afford education. But until we have education, we will always be poor. And that to me seemed like the cruelest catch-22 in the world, that you're too poor to afford it, but until you have it, you're always going to be poor. And entire nation states can make that same statement. So that was my cathartic moment. I vowed to do something. I vowed to come back with several thousand books. I was back within a year. I had a donkey train with 6 donkeys, 3,000 books, and that's really the origin of how Rotary got started. And that was just 11 years ago that was it. And when I went back to that village, I'll land the plane here very quickly. When I got back to that village a year later and saw those same 450 kids who are now another year older lined up, and it was like the biggest thing that had ever happened in this village, that we were showing up with 3,000 used children's books. But these kids had never seen brightly colored children's books before. And to see them diving into the pile, it was like a mosh pit. It was like literacy palooza. The kids couldn't wait to get their hands in the book. And I looked at that and I felt good. But then I said, this is a drop in the ocean, because you live in a world that has 793 million illiterate people. It's not enough to do one library or 10 or 100 or 1,000. We're going to have to do tens of thousands of these rural libraries. So that was the moment that I mentally began marching myself towards the exit of Microsoft to devote my life to this cause, that every single child should have access to books.
Well, certainly that qualifies as thinking big. To believe that starting with a yak going up the hillside that you could solve world illiteracy. Help me figure out how you got the idea that you could even begin to solve that problem. I mean, because all of us go around the world and we see problems and we walk by them, or we think that's too big just to deal with.
Yeah, I think for me, I'd been fortunate that whenever I traveled for Microsoft, my boss would always laugh at me, because I'd always do this little stopover in Vietnam or a stopover in India, and I would always tack a little vacation onto my business trips and wanted to go discover the world. So being in a place like Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge killed 1.7 million people and burned down the schools and burned the books, I just had traveled enough places where I'd seen that poverty hits kids the hardest. And it's not just poverty that's depressing, I think it's poverty of opportunity. It's when a child does not go to school. And if you look at a place like rural Zambia, 4 out of 5 girls don't make it past grade 7. And then all the experts, all the development experts are stumped as to why 2 billion people live on less than $2 a day. Well, if 80% of your girls don't make it past grade 7, of course people are going to stay poor. And all of us in this room probably can think of a parent or a grandparent or a great-grandparent who was poor. They were the ones to break the cycle of poverty. Almost always there's an education. I see a lot of heads nodding. You're thinking about that grandparent or great-grandparent. Somehow somebody got a lucky break. In my case, my father was one of 7. He grew up in poverty. He was the only one of his family to go through university. And the only reason he went to university was because he got a scholarship. And he always told me, you are lucky, 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 because that propelled us to the middle class. And then we had a public school, a public library, a school library, a great public university. I went to the University of Colorado. I was a product of a public school environment where I just felt like I got lucky. And so I looked at all the places in the world where that wasn't happening and said, if I don't think big about this, I'm completely lame. And the way I got to think big about it is by making a dramatic exit from Microsoft at age 35 and saying, this is it, this is how I'm spending my life.
Tim, let me ask you the same question. How did you first come to learn about Room to Read, and what led you then to become so committed that you agreed to be co-chairman?
Can everybody hear me? Working okay? So let me give a little background. I'll make it really, really short. John and I share actually quite a bit actually in terms of how we feel about the world and how we see the world and how compelled we are actually to change it. And I think there's a lot of similarities actually in our backgrounds in different sorts of ways, but similarities. I was born to a blue-collar family. My father was a machinist. He and my mom were children of the Depression. So they had grown up in a very, very poor, shut-down town in western Maryland and all that sort of stuff. They drilled into my brother and I the value of getting educated, and secondly, being resourceful. Those two things. If you don't have anything else, go get educated and be very resourceful with it. And I thought that if I ever got to the point, believe it or not, pretty early on, I thought, if I ever get to the point where I'm lucky enough, get a few breaks, work really hard, make enough to give back, I would. I got a scholarship to go to graduate school. I worked my way through as a tractor mechanic through undergraduate school, fell in love with what I was learning. And so I graduated valedictorian as a result of falling in love with it in engineering, and got scholarships. And it was at that moment when I got a scholarship to come out here to go to graduate school where the penny really dropped for me. And it was my break. And it's exactly what John is saying. I mean, it is a break in the cycle of what our families had to experience. And so roll the videotape forward many years. I did work really, really hard, did get a few breaks, got lucky enough to earn enough money to not have to work for anybody else, et cetera, et cetera. And I kept this same drive that one day, if I got to that point, I was going to give back. And it's a perfect stage in my life to be doing that for a bunch of reasons. Along came when I set up a foundation, poured a bunch of capital into it, funded a bunch of scholarships for a while. I had this really brain-dead kind of elevator pitch, that I was going to go and fund a whole lot of scholarships for a whole lot of kids who were really, really smart and really, really poor. That was my elevator pitch. And we did that. But getting closer and closer to the work, what I really kind of discovered was that that's the easiest part of it. There is friction out there in the economy of capital that goes and funds education especially for people in the United States. And you can help undo a little bit of that by funding it, but the real hard work is with young people who are highly at risk. And so our foundation has everything to do with that. And it is only focused on education, only focused on funding those youth out there who are highly at risk and very, very few assets to go get educated. We had that foundation, I say we because my wife Pam and I co-manage that with our fiduciary partners, et cetera. We're very driven by it, very driven to give back. We're moving more and more of our time intentionally to the nonprofit sector. I still do for-profit venture stuff because I love that, but we're intentionally moving it there. We were executing along on that, and one night, after a really long, intense week, we decided to hop in the car, drive out to the coast here, drop into a little bookstore over in Half Moon Bay on a foggy night, and I see this book on the shelf, Leaving Microsoft to Change the World. It's John's book. I hadn't heard about the book before. I started to read the book jacket, read the back cover jacket, notes, started to read the first chapter, got into the second chapter. The store owner comes over to me and gives me massive evil eye. Like, dude, if you want to read the book, buy the book, and I showed it to...
We've got one right here.
And to make a kind of a long story relatively short, Pam wanders over to me and said, I said, this guy seems to check every one of the boxes in what is our litmus test for things that we want to invest in heavily in philanthropy. We can talk about that later if you want. And she said, I kind of know that guy. So for Christmas that year, she gave me a Christmas present of John, kind of a surprise breakfast. We were at a hotel up in San Francisco, you probably remember this. And I thought I was having a nice breakfast with my wife, Pam, and she got up and she said, I'm leaving, and I said, what? That's a surprise. And up walks John. So we sat down, had a fantastic breakfast, really engaged, and one thing led to another, and we got involved with Room to Read.
For the record, his wife actually asked me to wear a bow. I was like, how large is the check going to be?
Not big enough.
So what is it that you thought you could bring to the organization? I mean, I can see why you were enamored with it, but obviously you must think that you can, bring money, but also some of your skills. And
yeah, I mean, we all try to convince ourselves we've got a lot of wisdom and skill, and to some extent, maybe a little bit of that's true. I don't know, but I went through engineering school. I didn't go to business school. I learned how to do business, School of Hard Knocks, making payroll and stuff, and had a lot of roles over a long period of time. Small stuff, my own companies I started, sold one to Motorola, went to work for Motorola, went and did a turnaround later, came back to the Valley to join up with Jerry and David to kick off Yahoo, grew that successfully and stuff. So, a lot of great scar tissue and a lot of great experiences. And I think, there are two ends to this, bookend this idea. John and his team, if you don't know anything about Room to Read, run this like a business. And it was apparent to me, it is full of a number of things that are on our litmus test when we make investments through our foundation, to find people like that and organizations that are run like that. When they are, it's such a natural overlay of business skills, it's not fun. And I thought, what a great opportunity. This organization is at a point where it's grown, it grew kind of nicely for a while, established its value, its business model, it started to grow a little faster. It's at a scale now that's really very interesting, has huge impact already. And it's at a stage where if they do things right and think ahead about some of the things they need to lay in place for scalability, right, there's no reason why it can't grow to 10 times its size. So that's intriguing as a business guy.
So tell us, John, just a little bit about what it is that you've done at Room to Read that's based on experiences you had, I presume, at Microsoft, taking those sort of that business acumen and applying it to the nonprofit sector.
Well, I think one of the great things about tech is that in business in general is people are not afraid to think big. And you look, when I was at Microsoft, you know, on the Office team, we had like 6% share in word processors and 8% share in spreadsheets back in '93. And Robbie Bach, who I worked for, declared that Microsoft was going to get to 80% market share in those markets. People said that was crazy because we're going to do it anyway. And we hit, I think, 85% within a couple of years. You look at Google, you know, we're going to organize all the world's information and make it accessible. You look at Facebook, you look at these companies, they're not afraid to think big. So one of the things I want to do at Room to Read is to say, look, let's face two basic numbers. 300 million. That's the number of kids in the developing world who woke up this morning and did not go to school. 300 million. That's pathetic. 793 million is the number of people in the world today who are illiterate, and 98% of them are in the developing world. So building one school or building one library or funding one scholarship for a young girl in Cambodia, to me, just didn't seem like it was good enough. We needed to think bigger about this. And I was fortunate enough to work for a company like Microsoft where you were encouraged to think big, take ownership, take action, and to the point from the last panel, not be afraid to fail, to take a risk. And so where we are today, you know, I'm very proud of our local teams and what they've achieved. We have 13,500 girls on long-term scholarships in 9 countries across the developing world with a 97% pass rate to the next grade. We have opened 1,443 schools across the developing world using a community challenge grant model where the communities co-invest with us. Every 26 hours, a new school opens under the Room to Read banner. We've now opened 12,500 libraries. We open 6 new libraries a day on average. Every 4 hours, a new library opens somewhere in the world. 6 million kids have access to our libraries and schools now. 6 million young people have a better chance to get educated because of the fact that Room to Read exists. But what's sad about this is, Tim and I talk about this all the time, if you take the number of kids we've reached as a numerator and the number of people we need to reach as a denominator, 793 million people, we're not even 1% of the way to the goal. So to your question, Eric, about why did Tim take the role, why did I recruit Tim? Tim has scaled businesses globally. He also has figured out how to make sure that the founders are useful without the founders getting in the way. And I think any founder who's still the CEO, their journey is not done yet, right? Howard Schultz, Michael Dell are still CEO of their organizations. I'm very proud that 3 years ago, I stopped being CEO and became board chair. And then my goal is to say, I don't want to be board chair, I want to be board co-chair under the theory of an organization is stronger if you have more leaders in more places, and leaders don't get much better than TK.
Thank you.
Well, so Tim, you mentioned that this organization can get to be 10 times the size. How many years till you get there? And what are going to be the things that you need to do to get there? And what's the biggest risks? And I'd like you to, respond afterwards, John.
I don't know how long it'll take to get to 10 times the size. Room to Read is roughly on a $40 million operating budget per year now, so that would be $400 million in operating budget. We haven't crunched the math. We haven't done the math, John and I, yet. John's really famous, by the way, for an acronym called BHAG, Big, Hairy, Audacious Goals.
I borrowed that from Jim Collins.
Yeah, he did. And it's part of the vernacular. And this is the subject. This is one of those sorts of things. Pick a number. I don't know the answer to it, but I know that it will get there. Absolutely every level of confidence that it will. It will not, absolutely not be easy. The kind of things we're going to have to pay attention to are some of the things you'd really predict that everybody who's run and scaled organizations for a long time are people. It's all about that. It's all really about enough structure, Goldilocks rule. Not too much that it gets in your way, not too little so that you don't have enough of it and you go to anarchy with it, but just enough at every stage. And it keeps moving, the target keeps moving. So paying a lot of attention to laying in more and more people at just the right levels who have all the scalability that you're going to need for the next leg up ahead of it, paying attention to your cash, looking for increasingly incremental revenue models, for generating the cash that we'll need to feed that kind of engine. And then at an operating level, it's all of the above, plus other challenges, because as you spread around, we're in 9 countries now, you do face the practicalities of executing in local market, with a whole lot of variability, in government structure and all kinds of other stuff. So those things, figuring out those things, the model that Room to Read is on, by the way, John didn't share one other statistic, which is the organization just passed its 10 millionth local language published book that we gave out. John gave it out in Vietnam, I think, a couple of weeks ago. All of those things are things that, it's roll the videotape forward, roll the videotape forward, roll the videotape forward, look ahead, lay in all the stuff you need to scale all the time.
John? Capital. We need money. The demand for what we do, for educating kids in the poorest parts of the world, is nearly unlimited. And we're very fortunate a number of our funders are in the room here today. And for those of you who believed in Room to Read when we were young, thank you. I mean, Draper Richards Kaplan is here, and Skoll, and Twitter, and Google, and Microsoft, and Facebook, and a number of other of our funders are here, the Gates Foundation. But we need more corporate partnerships, and I will put in a plug for anybody in the room here who works for a company. Let's talk. I'm John at roomtoread.org. We have fantastic corporate partnerships, but we need to do a lot more. And the reason we need to do a lot more is very simple. Every day we lose is a day we don't get back. And if you're a company, there's 2 billion people in the world living less than $2 a day for whom your product or service is completely irrelevant. 2/7 of the world could care less about your product or service because they're too poor. So if we want to look at long-term economic growth rates and goosing them in the next 2 decades, there's nothing better we could do than pick 2 billion people up out of poverty. And the only proven long-term ticket out of poverty, Dambisa Moyo, who's a global ambassador for Room to Read, wrote the book Dead Aid, points out very well that no country has ever escaped poverty by relying on foreign aid. It's education, education, education. And I'll challenge everybody in the room with 2 simple statements if I can make. I know we're running low on time, but 2 simple statements. 1, without education, you're not you, and without education, I'm not me, and without education, Eric and Tim are not Eric and Tim. So we have, in my mind, a great opportunity to do for the poorest parts of the world what somebody somewhere did for us by giving us an education. I think if you look at the long-term future for what we want to accomplish, we want to take this notion that exists today, the notion that you can be born in the wrong place at the wrong time to the wrong parents, and be told, sorry, you did not get educated. We believe that idea belongs on the scrap heap of human history, and we want to put it there in this lifetime.
Well, thanks very much. I look at a lot of... I just want to say, I mean, in my capacity as editor of the magazine, I look at hundreds, not, over the time, thousands of organizations, and Room to Read really is right up there at the top. I'm not being paid for an endorsement or something, but I have to say that. I mean, they really are running on all cylinders. I think they exemplify the best of what the nonprofit sector can do. And as I said at the beginning, I think are a great example of the impact that Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley thinking is having on the nonprofit sector. So thank you again.
Can I just say one more thing too? If anybody in the audience has children or nieces or nephews between the ages of 3 and 8, I have copies of my first children's book, which is titled Zach the Yak with Books on His Back. It's about a magic yak who delivers books to kids who don't have them, and it's a good read. It's actually underwritten by our partners at the Republic of Tea, so it's a zero cogs product for us. I've got copies that I'm happy to autograph, and if you want to go home and share with your kids that there's a way to help kids get books, Zach the Yak is our spokes yak. I'm happy to sign it and give you a copy.